Good morning. The last time I had the privilege of preaching here, I spoke on Exodus chapter 1. And just to help us to understand the context of chapter 2, which we've just heard read to us, permit me to remind you of what is happening to and with God's people here in this passage. If you remember, in the first chapter of Exodus, we are told that the children of Israel have supernaturally grown so numerous that the people of Egypt fear that they will be overwhelmed in their own country. And the Pharaoh has decided that he needs to get rid of the people of Israel. And he decides to torture them to death through slave labor, but that has no impact on their birth rate. He then commands that all Hebrew baby boys should be killed at birth, and he orders the midwives of Egypt to do his dirty work for him. But the leaders of the midwives, who are called Shiphrah and Puah, disobey this command, preferring, it says, to obey the God of Israel. And you may remember that I left you with the thought that when women take center stage in the Bible, the narrative is often about redemption or salvation. And you may note that going forward in chapter 2, all of the main characters are again women. So let's move on to chapter 2, and in my usual manner, I'm going to take you through this passage and then apply it to our lives. So verse 1. Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. Now, to use a motoring metaphor, we haven't got out of first gear yet, but already we need to slam on the brakes because we just need to talk about the parents of Moses for a moment or two. Firstly, I just want you to know that they are Levites. And clearly this account here is before the law has been given by God to Moses, obviously. But we know that the Levites were later called and chosen by God for a special purpose. They are going to be priests and servants of the Most High. And perhaps we get an inkling here that God is already at work molding and shaping the Levites for their future service. And in the Hebrew here, there is a sense that Moses' father goes searching for a wife, but he doesn't have to search too far away from home. If you nip over to Exodus chapter 6, it says this in verse 13. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron about the Israelites and Pharaoh king of Egypt, and he commanded them to bring the Israelites out of Egypt. And then there's one of those great long genealogies in the Bible, which if you're a bit like me, you immediately go buzz-eyed and skip over it until you get to something more exciting. But if we skip over this, we miss something important. In verse 20, it says, Amram married his father's sister, Jochebed, who bore him Aaron and Moses, and Amram lived 137 years. So there we have it. Moses' father was married to his aunt. Now, it wasn't uncommon in those days for men to marry close female relatives, but nonetheless, it's just a Bible quiz question for you, isn't it? Who did Moses' father marry? He married his aunt. But that as it's may, what I want you to see here is that the important point is that getting married and having children at this time of intense suffering and slavery and genocide is a step of extraordinary faith. It says, in the face of bleakness and despair, I believe that there is a future. So, verse 2, she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. Now, I don't know who it was who said that all babies look like Winston Churchill. And quite rightly, all mums think that their babies are special, but that is not exactly what it means here when it describes him as being a fine child. On 2 occasions in the New Testament, we are told something specific about baby Moses. And firstly, in Hebrews chapter 11, do you remember that's that great passage about faith? And the writer of the Hebrews culls all of these examples from the Old Testament. Hebrews 11:23, he talks about Moses' parents. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child. And again in Acts chapter 7 it says, at that time Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. He was beautiful in the eyes of God. And don't you think that's something? There is something about this baby Moses that marks him out as being extraordinary. Right from the Father heart of God, God has reached out from the heavens and placed his hands on this child, and somehow his parents know it. Verse 3 and 4. But when she could hide him no longer, she took a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. And then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the river Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen. Now, I'm sure that you know that the wording used here for basket is ark, and that the wording used for waterproofing the ark is identical to the wording used for the account of building Noah's ark way back in Genesis. So if you're a Jewish reader in particular, you're going to be thinking that there's a very clear steer here, that there are similarities between the story of Noah and this account of Moses. And just note that both stories are talking about God delivering his people from destruction. But there's another similarity. Back in Genesis, people must have thought that Noah was absolutely bonkers. I mean, I know that you know the story, but there's Noah building the ark year after year after year without the slightest hint of rain. But have you ever wondered about Moses' parents were thinking? What were they thinking? They've cobbled together some kind of basket from reeds and placed their special 3-month-old son, their beautiful baby, into the river. And you know, there's so much that could go wrong, isn't there? Aren't the crocodiles in the River Nile? Aren't the boats and all manner of things that could do real harm to a baby? And you know, at this point, I am happy to disclose that I did work for Child Protection Services for a number of years. And if anyone pulled a stunt like this now, they would be arrested and their child would be placed outside of their care. Either this is radical trust in a God-given plan, or it is simply madness. Verse 5 and 6, then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby and felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. We just need to talk about Pharaoh's daughter for a moment or two. Here we have Pharaoh's daughter coming to the Nile to ritually bathe as part of her pagan belief that the River Nile is sacred and that the cycle of life and death and the prosperity of the nation of Egypt depends on the gods being worshipped and appeased. Which of course is why Pharaoh has commanded that all Hebrew baby boys are drowned in the River Nile. They are to be a grand sacrifice to the gods of Egypt, and they will ensure the prosperity of the country. And of course, it's rather ironic, isn't it, that Moses is placed in the Nile. In God's economy, destruction turns to deliverance. So there we have it. Pharaoh's daughter and her retinue of servants and slaves are there, and the baby is discovered. And I want you to note the providence of God here. As Pharaoh's daughter has been brought up to fear and loathe and hate the Hebrew people. But just like the midwives in chapter 1, she chooses to disobey the command of her father. If anyone else in the whole of Egypt had found baby Moses on that riverbank, he would have been killed. For no one else would have dared to disobey their king except the king's daughter. God has prepared and has softened her heart in a quite remarkable way. Verse 7, then his sister Miriam asked Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? Now, most Jewish scholars suggest that Miriam, the sister of Moses, was only 7 at this point in time. If that is the case, she is either blessed with a commendable degree of confidence, or this is a supernatural work of God. And the rest, as they say, is history. Yes, she said. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. Just in passing, have you ever wondered what Moses' parents called him before he was named Moses by Pharaoh's daughter? See, I stay awake at night worrying about these things, but I sense there is a measure of peace and assurance in my congregation. Okay, that's a well-known story, but let's spend a little time applying this passage to ourselves, and there's just a couple of thoughts that I'd like to share with you. Firstly, don't let the times you live in stop you stepping out in faith. You could be the Moses this world needs to have. That's quite portentous, so I'll give you it again. Don't let the times you live in stop you stepping out in faith. You could be the Moses this world needs to have. You see, the parents of Moses stepped out in faith by firstly having a child in these times, and then entrusting that remarkable child to the River Nile. And I know that Trish has already said as much this morning, and I know that we've echoed it in our prayers. But almost increasingly, whenever I lead prayers of intercession at my church, I often start by saying, folks, I don't know where to start, and I don't know where to finish. We are surrounded as God's people by so much hopelessness and despair, by so many tragic and difficult situations, that, it's almost easy to become overwhelmed, even spiritually paralyzed in our walk of faith. And sometimes in my humanity, I get discouraged. And I think to myself, the spiritual and cultural landscape in our country is so difficult that it would be easy to think that our faith and our witness is of little relevance, and that maybe we are banging our heads against a collective wall of indifference. But then I give my head a wobble, and then I say, if God's church does not step out in faith and speak of these times, the world will follow other voices. If God's church does not step out in faith and provide leadership, the world will follow other leaders. If God's church does not step out in faith and preach the gospel, we should not be surprised if the world creates its own salvation. And of course, even in my moments of despondency, I need to be balanced. There are many churches stepping out in faith. And you know what? God is at work in our land. I'm sure that you must have heard about the Quiet Revival. According to a large-scale survey undertaken by the Bible Society, there are now over 2 million more people attending church than there were 6 years ago. Isn't that something? Close to half of young black people aged 18 to 34 are now attending church at least monthly. Young adults, especially those aged 18 to 24, are showing a renewed interest in faith, with 16% attending church at least monthly, up from a mere 4% in 2018. Maths ain't my strong point, but isn't that a fourfold increase in young people attending church? And there is evidence of a rise in Bible reading and belief in God, particularly among young adults, both inside and outside of the church. And I know, because I've heard your prayers this morning, that you have got a place in your heart for young people, and how desperately our young people need to hear the message of salvation. I was watching a very moving testimony, I suppose, on YouTube the other day. It's quite a remarkable story. It was the story of a young pastor who had been seconded for a 2-year period to a church with 9 elderly members in the South Wales Valley, in the poorest parish in Western Europe. And he thought that he would go there, and over that 2-year period, basically, he would manage the closure of the church and return to a comfortable parish in leafy southern England. But you know what? God had different ideas. And now he has a congregation of over 100 people. But get this, it's a church full of recovering addicts, sex workers, asylum seekers, and criminals. His Mansour church has been burgled 11 times in 10 years. He runs an alpha course in the local prison because so many of his young men land up there. But you know, the Spirit is moving in South Wales. And then I turned channels on YouTube to Holy Trinity Brompton HTB, which I'm sure you must be aware of. And in their service they had, 300, 400 affluent middle-class people, the majority under 40, worshipping in a fantastic converted Gothic church with all the latest tech and all the latest songs. And you know, I thank God for HTB and the influence that it has had on our land. But you know, folks, there's chalk and cheese there. South Wales, HTB, in every respect they're a world apart. But let me challenge and encourage you this morning. If God can move in London and in South Wales, he can and will sweep through this community as well. Friends, don't give up. Step up, step out, full of faith. Despite our doubts, God is at work, and you could be the Moses this world needs to have. Finally, let's just talk about identity. To whom do you belong? It might be Father's Day, but you know, the hero to me in all of this is Moses' mother. She lets go of her son and commits him to the currents and the dangers of the River Nile, and then 3 months later relinquishes him into the hands of the very family who are committed to destroying her and her people by whatever means necessary. It's great for us, isn't it, this morning? We can sit here and talk glibly about radical trust in God and supernatural deliverance. But gosh, if we get into the skin of the story, isn't this a heartbreaking story? What mother gives up her youngest son not once but twice? Perhaps only a mother with a rock-solid belief in the providence of God. And that mother had a profound, lasting impact on her son. In closing, let me just take you back to Acts chapter 7, which we briefly read a while ago. And it says, at that time Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. For 3 months he was cared for by his family. When he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as her own son. And then get this, Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. But when he was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people. For 40 years, Moses was tutored and taught and influenced by the Egyptians, but never ever forgot to whom he belonged. He resisted the pull of paganism, status and wealth and power, and chose instead to follow the God of Israel. And don't you think that is remarkable? God has chosen and called Moses and stamped his identity deep within his heart. Friends, this morning, as we have thought about the fatherhood and the father heart of God, let me encourage you to meditate on the question, to whom do you belong? We have a very different set of influences and challenges to face, surrounded as we are by the corrosive influence of a celebrity culture, the nonsense of social media, the rise of militant atheism, profound arguments and polarized positions about issues such as sexuality and gender and assisted dying. But be a Moses this morning. Friends, resist it all. And let us, as that ancient chorus tells us, turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face. And you know what? The things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and his grace. Amen. Let's pray.